Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one of our comparative economics webinar. Today, we are delighted to have Beata Javorcik presenting. Before briefly introducing her, let me just remind you of the very basic ground rules, house rules of the seminar. And if you have any clarification questions, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. We'll break the middle of the presentation, 20 minutes in, and try to summarize your questions so that Beata can react to them. And at the end of the presentation, we have a standard questions and answers session in which we will unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. Then I'm going back to our speaker today. We are absolutely delighted to have Beata Javorcik. She is professor of economics at Oxford University, currently on leave, and she's working as the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. Beata is going to be talking to us about unraveling deep integration, looking at labor market effects of the Brexit vote. We are absolutely delighted to have you, Beata. We're really looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much for accepting our invite. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for these kind words, Mauro. Thank you very much for the invitation, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining you, even though I cannot see you. I will be talking about unraveling deep integration. This is very much work in progress, and this is joint work with Ben and Catherine, whom you see as my co-panelists. They are both about to obtain their DPhil degrees from Oxford. We also have a fourth co-author, Leila O'Kane, who is from Burning Glass Technologies, the firm that has kindly shared the data with us. As many of you know, the last 30 years of the literature in international trade have been devoted to understanding the impact of increasing international integration. This paper takes a look at the opposite, mainly at dismantling of deep integration between the UK and the European Union. And the outcome we consider is demand for labor as captured by online job advertisement. And in particular, we are focusing on services rather than trade, mainly because UK is a services dominant economy, and many of the 21st century's barriers to trade are barriers to services, but also because this is what seems to matter in this context. So more specifically, in this paper we ask, how did the possibility of UK exports facing barriers to trade in the European Union affects labor demand? So we are actually talking about the threat of barriers, so barriers that have not occurred yet. We are looking at the near universe of UK online job postings. We are considering the period between 2015 and 2019. And we will look at labor demand from the perspective of travel to work areas, basically looking at how the employment structure of a particular travel to work area exposes it to potential barriers to trade. We will consider both trade in services and in goods, but as I mentioned, it's really trade in services that's going to play the key role here. And of course, we'll control for other channels such as migration and exchange rate. In case you have to leave early, let me give you the preview of our results. Hopefully, within the next 30 minutes or so, I will convince you that travel to work areas which are more exposed to the possibility of export barriers in the European Union have seen a reduction in the number of job ads relative to the less exposed areas. And this reduction has happened. We are looking at a diff in diff, we are comparing the period prior to the Brexit referendum to the period after the Brexit referendum. We will first consider professional services, and then we will zoom in on financial services. We will also zoom in into the post-referendum period, where we will measure uncertainty associated with the future trading relationship between the UK and the EU. We will measure it taking an off-the-shelf index, as well as our indices that we have constructed ourselves based on newspaper searches and Google searches. One of the messages emerging from our study is that, not surprisingly, it is the higher skilled and professional jobs that have been affected more by this possibility of trade barriers. In the interest of time, let me skip the related literature. Let me just say that our work is related to labor market effects of trade integration, to the literature on Brexit, to the literature on US-China trade war, and there's also a separate literature on online job postings. If you take the first look at the data, so from 2015 to the end of last year, you see that after seasonal adjustment, the trajectory of online job ads in the UK and in the US have been on a very different trajectory. In the UK, after 2018, we have seen a decline in job postings, while in the US, there was a pretty strong increase in online job postings. And the vertical red line that you see here, that is the timing of the Brexit referendum. So you see that there is a decline, but this decline is happening actually with quite a lag relative to the referendum. Now, probably most of you are already sick of hearing about Brexit, but in case somebody is joining us from another country, let me remind you that the referendum took place in 2016 in the late June, and the result was completely unexpected. 48% of voters chose the Remain option, while 52% voted for Brexit. And the result has taken everybody by surprise, and as reflected in the fact that actually there were hardly any plans about what the trading relationship with the EU should look like in the post-Brexit period. There actually hadn't been much of a real debate about this topic prior to the referendum. So there was a period of actually great uncertainty, and people had relatively little idea about what will happen. It took a while to shake off this shock. And I think that to some extent could explain why the effects we see have been quite delayed. Now, we focus on services exports because UK is heavily focused on services. 80% services account for 80% of output and almost half of exports. Financial services play a key role, being responsible for 7% of output and 29 billion in tax revenue. Now, the UK has already exited the European Union. Brexit took place at the end of January of this year. However, as of today, we have no clarity yet about the nature of the trading relationship next year, when the transition period will be over, the transition period which will finish at the end of this calendar year. Now, if the UK does not manage to reach an agreement with the European Union, then it becomes a third country, meaning it will trade with the EU on the WTO terms. And this narrative about trading with the EU on the WTO terms actually has been present very much throughout the post Brexit period, where there were many discussions about the so-called hard Brexit. So this would be quite a shift for British services providers. The EU single market is the most integrated area for services in the world. So suddenly, as a result of not being part of the single market and instead being treated just like any other WTO member, British firms would face considerable barriers. Now, as I mentioned in our analysis, we take the perspective of local labor market, so-called travel to work areas. We focus on 218 such areas. We exclude Northern Ireland. And such an area is defined based on two criteria. 3/4 of people who live in the area also work in that area. So this is about people who are part of the labor force. And at least 3/4 of the people who work in the area also reside there. And the travel to work area must have economically active population of at least 3,500. Now, these travel to work areas range in size from less than 7,000 people to over 8 million. So they are actually quite heterogeneous in terms of size. Oxford is one of those travel to work areas. So if you look at this map, this area covers places such as Chipping, Norton, and Wallingford. Now, we will consider the employment structure in travel to work area in order to compile the measure of exposure to trade barriers that's relevant to this area. Our employment data will come from Business Register and Employment Survey. We'll use year 2015. So this is the year that is latest available. The BRES data cover about 91% of UK labor force. It's a survey covering 85,000 businesses. We'll also use data on present of migrant workers, services trade, and standard information on tariffs. Just one second, okay. Now, how do we measure barriers to services export? We are interested in the scenario that I mentioned, that UK becomes a third country and therefore it trades with the European Union on the MFN terms. To capture the change that this would involve, we rely on the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index that was compiled by the OECD. We'll use the 2014 value of the index. This index covers country-level commitments vis-a-vis WTO members, as well as having a separate value for European Economic Area. It is available for a range of services industries, including finance, insurance, legal, accounting, ICT, telecom, engineering, and architecture. So we are focusing on professional services. We are excluding transport from our analysis. This index focuses on several aspects of restrictions. So it considers restrictions on foreign entry. So for instance, restrictions such as limits on equity shares that can belong to foreigners, restrictions on movements of people, barriers to competition, and regulatory transparency. So examples include, for instance, restricting cross-border measures, quota on the number of intra-company transferees, ability to purchase land, and so on and so forth. So this is how we compile our index. So if you look at formula number 2, we first take a look at what we call STRI gap. This is the difference in the value of the index. This is the difference between how countries belonging to the WTO are treated versus how countries within the European Economic Area are treated when they are trading with other EU members. Now, this index is at the country level, which means that restrictions within the European Union are not uniform. They vary slightly by country. So we look at the SDRI gap pertaining to a services sector J, and we look at all countries within the European Economic Area and weigh this increase in restrictiveness that would happen after a hard Brexit by how important this country is for UK exports to the region. So this is, in a sense, the expected increase in restrictions, the threat of restrictions. The second part of the formula captures the number of pounds of exports going to the EEA from the UK per one person employed in the services industry. And here, as I mentioned, we have employment information for 2015. Now, so Formula 2 gives us the exposure to barriers after hard Brexit, so Brexit without an agreement being reached, preferential agreement being reached with the EU, for a particular sector J. Now we need to take this sectoral measure and bring it to our travel to work area. And we basically do it by looking at the employment composition in each travel to work area. So basically we consider all services industries that are represented in that area, and we use employment shares in that area to weigh the expected exposure to barriers in trade. And again, these employment shares pertain to the pre-referendum year. If you look at the raw index, you can see that there is quite a differential in how WTO members are treated in the European Union vis-a-vis or relative to how EU members are treated. So for instance, if you look at the top part of the graph, we see that Poland has heavy restrictions when it comes to imports of legal services. The SDRI index ranges from 0 to 1. So in the case of Polish treatment of legal services, it has the value almost of 0.8. That is because Poland restricts the ability of law firms or of foreigners active in this industry to acquire land, to acquire real estate. If they want to provide cross-border services, they have to have commercial presence. There are requirements that certain data have to be stored locally. There are quotas on how many employees can be brought into Poland as intra-corporate transferees. There are some labor market tests for bringing such people, and foreign professionals are required to take local examinations. Now, if you look at none of those restrictions pertain to legal professionals coming from the European Economic Area, and the value of the SDRI index is about 1.7. So the light blue bar you see, this is the gap, the difference between MFN barrier versus the intra-EEA treatment. So basically the logic of our exercise is that unless the UK government strikes a preferential deal with the European Union, instead of facing the dark blue bars as these low restrictions, they will be facing the black restrictions. So they will suddenly find themselves at a big disadvantage vis-a-vis their EEA competitors when accessing the European Union market. And once we do this calculation at the travel to work area, you can see that there is quite a lot of difference between how exposed various areas are. Edinburgh seems to be very highly exposed, while Bristol's exposure is half of the value of that of Edinburgh. Now, what about trade in goods? So we are not ignoring it completely. Again, if there is no preferential deal, the UK will be trading with the European Union on WTO terms. That means that for almost 40% of products, where product is defined at the 6-digit level using harmonized system, the tariff of 5% or more will be applicable. For 11% of products, it will be tariff in excess of 10%, and for 2%, the tariff will be in excess of 15%. Now I'm going to discuss the threat to tariffs being exposed on exports, but we also later consider a tariff on intermediate inputs that UK would reciprocate with, and tariff protections. So again, depending on employment structure, travel to work areas will have differential impact to those tariff threats. So here we look at in an analogous manner, we consider the average MFN tariff that is applicable to all products belonging to Sector J. So remember, right now there are no tariffs. In the absence of agreement, MFN tariffs will be enforced. These are EU MFN tariffs. We take the average of those for products belonging to Sector J. Then we ask, what's the amount, what's the value of exports in sterling that is sent by this sector to the European Union per a person employed in this sector. So this gives us a tariff exposure for a given industry. And here we are talking about 4-digit SIC sectors. And then to bring it to the level of the region, we weigh it again by employment shares in respective sectors. And again, here you can see quite a big difference in exposures of various localities to the threat of export tariffs. Now, let me say a few words about our data. Our data comes from Burning Glass Technologies. It's a firm that scrapes the universe of online job postings. They do so daily. They source those ads from over 40,000 job boards and company websites. During the period under study, they considered almost 30 million of such job ads in the UK. And they say that they clean the data so that they are not double counting jobs that are posted on multiple bulletin boards. They classify those jobs by location, so it's very easy for us to match these jobs to travel to work areas. These are the standard definitions used by the ONS. When we compared the Burning Glass Technology data, they cover on average 86% of total vacancies that were reported by the UK Vacancy Survey. Now, what's the advantage of focusing on job postings? So first of all, this is information that is happening in a sense in real time, high frequency. We can look at how job postings have been developing, how trends have been changing on monthly basis after the referendum. Also, in contrast to employment, to actual employment, which is an equilibrium outcome, which captures both the demand and the supply side, to a large extent, posting capture the demand side. Yes, you may be concerned that the referendum had an impact on supply of labor, particularly the Eastern European or EU labor. We are going to take that into account. Here is the picture of raw data, lots of fluctuations, but you clearly see a big decline starting in the second half of 2018. So on to our baseline specification. So we focus on 2015 to 2019. We consider monthly data. Our dependent variable is the log of the number of jobs posted in a given travel to work area in a given month. The variable of interest is in standard def/indef. It is the post-referendum period interacted with our measures of exposure to trade barriers. We control for other region-specific time-varying factors. We have month fixed effects, so these are time fixed effects, as well as travel to work area effects. And we cluster our standard errors two ways: travel to work area as well as time period. We are considering other channels, such as exchange rate. Those of you working in the UK took a pay cut on the day after the referendum. The sterling depreciated heavily, 8% vis-a-vis dollar, 6% vis-a-vis the euro. We take this overnight depreciation and we look at how it affects different industries based on their geographic export structure and their geographic import structure. And actually, we are not doing this ourselves, thanks to Swati Dhingra being kind and sharing the data with us. We use the measures that these are sector-specific measures that are relevant to particular sectors. So this is the depreciation that happened immediately after the referendum, that then we interact with the post-referendum dummy, and it's affecting exporting and importing sectors differently based on geography of their trade. And we bring these measures to the travel to work area level based on the employment structures. We also take into account presence of migrants from the European Union. We have information from annual population survey, which is a continuous household survey. It allows us to see number of EU or Eastern EU nationals in a given UK region and SIG1 industry. So here regions are much more aggregated. These are only 11 regions as opposed to 200 plus travel to work area, and the industries are 1 digit as opposed to 4 digit. Nevertheless, we know exactly what is the EU share in total employment in this broadly defined region and industry. And then we use travel to work area employment shares in a given industry to create the predicted EU national share in the travel to work area. And we do it for EU workers as well as Eastern European workers. So finally, some results. So we find negative and statistically significant impact of the threat to barriers in services on job postings in travel to work areas. So basically travel to work areas that stand to lose more from barriers to services exports see a greater decline in their job postings. We see no action on the tariff front, so these are tariffs on goods. We see some indication that export sectors that benefit from depreciations, that this translates into greater online job postings. Now, how big are these effects? You may ask, well, they are economically meaningful. one standard deviation in exposure to barriers in professional services reduces job postings by about 3%. This is equivalent of a decline of 74 postings per month per travel to work area. As far as exchange rate impact is concerned, one standard deviation translates into a 3% increase in postings. Now, if we were to do an event study, this is what it would look like. So basically, we exclude Q1 and 2 of 2015. Remember, the referendum takes place in June 2016. That's the red line. We see no evidence of any pre-trends. And then after the referendum, there is a declining trend, though these effects become statistically significant around here, second quarter of 2018. And I think now it's the time to stop and take some questions.
Thank you very much, Beata. We do have a couple of questions. Jan Fiedremuts asks, how reliably does the APS capture immigrant workers? I would assume immigrants would be generally more reluctant to answer surveys. This is one. And the other question we have is regarding the figure you show for the EEA MFN gaps, the one with Poland on top, legal services. Are these just the largest gaps? I mean, can you say something about the distribution of it?
Okay, so these are the largest gaps that you see. I think on one of the slides we show what the standard deviation. Okay, see, this is the standard deviation exposure of travel to work area. Perhaps if Catherine can say something about variation there in those gaps, she could perhaps say it now or type it in chat later if she needs time.
Sure, yeah, so that's just the raw data, so that's not weighted by exports. I think when you weight it by exports, the greatest export weighted gap, I think, is Slovakia for engineering. Once we construct our trade weighted average STRI gaps, and the legal sector still has the highest trade weighted one. I don't know whether those answer the question.
Yes, I think so.
And how reliable migration data is. So in that, I mean, it's the source we use is considered to be the most reliable source. I don't believe that EU migrants would have any reason to be reluctant to answer surveys, right? EU migrants are allowed, for instance, to vote in EU elections while residing in the UK, or to vote in local elections. So, you know, they are completely legally there. They don't need to be registered. So I don't see any reason why there would be hesitation, being an EU migrant myself. I don't know whether Catherine or Ben would like to add anything.
I mean, the one thing is it's not necessary. We think of them as immigrants, but they're also EU, just anybody who's an EU national. So they may have actually lived in the UK, say, for 10, 20 years and just not obtained a UK passport, in which case you might not expect them. I would expect that might be more of an issue for the EU8 measure than necessarily the EU measure. But yeah, if you know of any better data sources, then we're always keen to see whether there's better ways we can check that measure.
Any other questions? Some of them have poor English skills. I see comments from Jan Fiedremuts. Possibly, but I would, yeah, I don't know whether people who do surveys have a survey in a foreign language. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. I don't know, Catherine, do you know?
I don't know, sorry.
And there's a question about Northern Ireland. We are not considering Northern Ireland because of this unique situation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much, Beata. Beata can continue then.
Okay, so let me continue. Thank you very much for your questions. So send more of them. Okay. Now, we also, so those of you who have been in the UK in the post-referendum period, you remember those, painful, torturous discussions. 3.5 years passed between the point of referendum and actually Brexit itself. And there were a lot of ups and downs and lots of mixed political signals. So we try to capture that in 3 ways. So first, we use an off-the-shelf index. This is a Brexit uncertainty index. This is collected based on a firm survey, asking firms every month whether Brexit is one of the top 3 drivers of uncertainty to their business. And second, we construct our own index using newspaper articles and Google data. This index is modeled on existing indices of economic policy uncertainty and world trade uncertainty. Nick Bloom is one of the co-authors on the paper cited here. And we construct the index by taking a list of 7 trade-related terms. You see them here: trade tariffs, WTO, and so on. Additionally, we impose a restriction that another term, such as Brexit, leave EU, EU, or no deal, must be present. And then, based on these two types of terms, we look at Google Trends. That gives us index of relative search intensity for these terms. And then we also look at the top 10 UK newspapers, and we look at number of articles including these terms, and construct an index based on this. You can see that uncertainty intensifies as in the second half of 2018 and later. Now, there are 2 ways of using these indices. You could either set them to their baseline value or to 0 prior. You could set them to 0 or to baseline value prior to the referendum, or you could consider just variation in the post-referendum period. We've done it both ways. It doesn't matter very much, but in the results that I show you, we are just considering the variation in the post-referendum period. So starting 2 months after the referendum. And if you do that, you still see that, so basically here what we do is we interact this measure of uncertainty based either on Google newspapers of this or this off-the-shelf index with the exposure of to barriers to professional services or tariffs and so on. And our results are confirmed. Basically, what we find is that greater uncertainty about future relationship between the UK and the EU decreases job ads in regions that are more exposed to the threat of barriers to services trade, right? And then we find this effect in 5 out of 6 specifications. And again, here we just use variation in the post-referendum period. We find here some negative effects on the presence of workforce from the European Union in general or from the new EU member states. How big are these effects? If you move, so if you look at the exposure of professional services and you move from the 25th percentile of uncertainty to the 75th percentile, that leads to a decline of postings by 3.3%. Equivalent decreases equivalent if we look in the context of EU national share, so how uncertainty affects travel to work areas that have greater exposure to EU nationals, that decreases postings in those areas by 8.8%. And the effect is even stronger for nationals from the new EU member states. The next thing we do is we consider a placebo test. So here we say, well, okay, let's take our travel to work areas as granted. Let's take everything as before, but now, instead of using actual postings from the UK, let's apply postings as observed in a given industry in a given month in the US. So basically, we create placebo postings from each travel to work area based on the actual employment shares in those travel to work areas in the pre-referendum period, but now we use them to weigh postings in the US. So basically, if there are some global trends to postings that maybe were responsible for driving our results before, they should show up here. But actually, we don't find any significant coefficients, and actually they are, they are actually positive in most of the regressions for professional services. The next thing we do is we focus on skill breakdown. ONS classifies skills into 4 categories. We take the top two as skilled, bottom 2 as unskilled, and here is the trajectory of ads for the 2 skill groups in the burning glass data. You see quite a significant decline in skilled jobs. And then we repeat our exercise, focusing on number of ads for highly skilled jobs versus number of ads for low skilled jobs. And what you see here is very, quite large, very highly significant results for highly skilled jobs, basically travel to work areas with greater exposure to threat of services barriers, see a bigger decline in the number of skilled job ads in the post-referendum period relative to areas which are less exposed. We see actually very little action for low skilled jobs. This is to be expected given that we are focusing on professional services. We see expected signs on exchange rate impacts. So basically, weaker pound is good for job ads in exporting sector. It's bad for sectors that rely on imported inputs. And if we compare these coefficients that we found for highly skilled job ads, the impact of barriers to professional services is larger. The estimated coefficient is larger. One standard deviation increases it translates into a decline, not increase, in posting by 3.8%. That is a reduction, that's equivalent to a reduction of 61 job ads per month per travel to work area. The next thing we do is we disaggregate our measure and look separately at each services industry. So basically we look at finance, engineering, information services. Information services, these are web hostings, these are cloud hosting, these are provision of analysis of data, for instance, from newspapers. So we do it for all sectors. You see here 5 specifications because we use the same controls as in previous tables, we just don't report them here. And what do we see? Well, we see that finance sector is the sector that's very strongly affected. So the prospect of barriers to exports of financial services very much are responsible for driving decline in job ads. We find a similar pattern for engineering, for information services, and somewhat less robust for legal services. Now we move to a separate part. We are just zooming in on financial services. Now, you probably remember the discussions about passporting rights. Passporting rights mean that any firm that is able to operate in any country in the European Economic Area is allowed to operate in any other place within that area. So this right is automatic. Now, very early in the game, because already in April 2017, the EU ruled out extending passporting rights to the United Kingdom. And in particular, here we are talking about the financial sector. That's what it very much mattered. Now, it took a while for the UK government to actually be explicit about it. It wasn't until July 2018 that the Brexit white paper explicitly stated that obtaining passporting rights for financial services was not possible, that this is not something that the government was seeking to obtain. Now, if you don't have passporting, that means you need to rely on the so-called equivalence. Equivalence means that it's based on the claim that the laws and regulations applicable in your country have the same result and have the same outcome as regulations in the European Union, and therefore your firms should be allowed to operate in the EU. And this is a much more limited arrangement. It's limited to a particular service industry. It can be revoked at any time, and it assumes, or it relies on close regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU. Now, if you have been following the debate, actually one of the objectives of Brexit is to break with the regulatory alignment, is to have freedom to introduce different laws and regulations. So that means that obtaining these equivalence approvals may be far from trivial. So what we do is we focus just on financial services jobs. Interestingly, financial services jobs are not limited to London, contrary to what many people may think. Actually, 2/3 of them are based outside of capital. So we use the same definition of STRI gap. Don't be alarmed by the term being used different. It's exactly the same. But now what's different is for financial services, we actually have exports of financial industry to the European Union at the regional level. These are the 11 large regions. So basically we look at the expected increase in barriers times weighted by regional exports of financial services per person employed in that region. So this gives us a regional exposure of financial services, and then we bring it to the travel to work area by using the travel to work area employment share. And as you can see here, there's a lot of variation in exposure. Obviously, London is very highly exposed, as Edinburgh, but so is Halifax, which is the home of the Halifax Building Society. So when we just zoom in on financial services, again, we find very strong, highly significant relationship between potential barriers that would be faced in the absence of agreement and the decline in the number of job postings. So travel to work areas that are highly exposed to those barriers in financial services see a greater decline in job postings in the post-referendum period. As before, we see some impacts of the exchange rate. How big is this effect? One standard deviation in financial service exposure decreases postings by 3%. If we look at, again, event studies, so quarter by quarter, we see big impact in the second quarter of 2018. We found some data, a report that was prepared by a think tank, and this report stated that by March of 2019, 275 financial institutions had already moved or were moving at least part of their operations to the continent, so to the European Union. So these big declines that are happening over time are quite reasonable because it took time on the part of those financial firms to decide to move. Then we do, as we did before, we split the jobs into high and low skilled. Here we also find impact on lower skilled job ads. If we disaggregate job ads by those broad categories, broad employment categories, we see the biggest effect on managers, directors, senior officials. We see big effect on professional occupations, associate professional occupations, skilled trade, and sales and customer service occupations. If you were puzzled by this category, this category includes workers such as IT and video engineers. It also includes cooks, caterers. So we think that it's quite plausible that there could be less hiring in those additional services that are needed by financial sector firms. The magnitudes range from 1 standard deviation change in exposure resulting in 5.7% decrease for sales service occupations to a 10% decrease for managers, directors, and senior officials. So basically we see disappearance of job ads for good jobs. These are highly skilled, highly paid senior jobs. We do a share of robustness. We focus on, we exclude London, our results go through. We do some shift share controls. We have alternative tariff measures. We control for protection of intermediate imports, NTBs. Basically, this has no effect on our result. So let me conclude by saying this, that in the post-referendum period, the threat of UK services firms facing barriers to exports in the EU has led them to reduce hiring. And this was particularly pronounced in financial services, in engineering, in legal profession and information services. Most of it pertained to highly skilled jobs, and many of those jobs that disappeared were senior professional occupations. Thank you. So I think perhaps now I should stop sharing my screen.
Noro, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, yes.
Perfect.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you very much, Beata. Thank you so much. I was talking on mute. Yeah, we will now have a kind of traditional, more standard Q&A session. If you have any questions, please raise your hands and we will mute you so that you can ask your questions. And we have one hand raised.
Jan, I will unmute you now. Now we can hear you. Yes, now it works.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I enjoyed it a lot. So one thing that I expected when you started talking about different sectors or different areas, I expected to see winners and losers. And unless I missed something, it seems that there are only losers. It's just that the losses are different in different sectors. Is there anyone who is going to gain, according to your data? Is there any sector or any occupation that stands to gain from Brexit? Thank you.
So we see some gains from depreciation of the sterling, right? If we define gains as reflected in additional job ads. So
any sector or basically service sector that would, so that was a separate line in your regressions, the gains from the depreciation. But are there any professions or any sectors that would actually gain from this? Or is it really that all services across the board are going to lose out?
So you saw the results for breakdown, right? So when we looked at individual services industry, and we didn't see any positive coefficient. Now, of course, what you need to keep in mind that this is a diff in diff, right? So we are comparing, so this is a relative result. So those sectors that are facing a threat of greater barriers are going to lose relative to sectors that are facing lesser barrier. Right? So it's a relative effect. It's not absolute effect, because in a sense we cannot comment on absolute figures, right? I mean, you could look at the impact, at the evolution of hiring in particular locations, but then there are many things that could be driving it. So it's hard to attribute it to the referendum.
Yeah, so essentially, what I'm kind of looking for is someone, so there's a trade diversion and a trade destruction in this case. So I'm looking for some kind of trade diversion. So firms where currently UK import services from the EU, and because of the barriers that will arise after Brexit, they will start acquiring these services domestically. That is essentially what I'm looking for. And it seems that there's no such sector, subsector within the service industry, because I didn't see any positive and significant coefficients in the results that you showed.
I mean, we could also look, just out of curiosity, we can look at trade balance of services. My hunch would be that UK is a very powerful exporter of services. But yeah, there were no positive coefficients there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. We would have time for two more questions. Just if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and then I will allow you to talk. No questions so far. Nauro, please.
Yeah, well, if there are no questions, I cannot raise it electronically, then I have to raise it this way. Yeah, I enjoyed it hugely. I was just wondering the effects you estimate by service categories, right? I mean, and legal vis-a-vis engineering, for example. Then I was just thinking about something that may be very dear to Beata's heart. What is if you have any thoughts in terms of potential spillovers? In other words, I mean, kind of bundles of services that go down together, right? Then Polish business, decrease, they buy less legal together with less financial services, for example. If there's any way of getting at that, I mean, your estimates would be if those kind of spillovers are significant, your estimates would be kind of conservative, which is nice. It's good. But I mean, I just wonder if you have any way of looking at it.
We haven't considered it, but it's actually an interesting point, whether some services are sold in bundles, right? So for instance, financial services together with legal services. And in one of the two is seeing a much higher barriers to trade that could affect the complementary service. That's a very interesting point. Yes. I mean, we could also potentially look, this is coming back to Jan's question about would UK enjoy protection in services, right? Because then imports from the EU would also be hindered, presumably. That's something we haven't looked, but I guess it's also, nobody knows which way the regulatory changes will go, but presumably that's something we could look at.
That's great. I have 17:30 sharp in my watch. Then I think we will officially close the seminar. Beata, once again, thank you so much. Catherine and Benjamin too. Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. Then we will officially stop recording now.
Yes.